Well, hello again Amiga fans, this is Wrangler speaking. I'm back with you with another video. It probably feels like a very long time since my last video, and it has been. And you might be thinking that that's because not a lot has been going on, so there's nothing to do videos about, but actually that is not true. There's been quite some work being done on a couple of topics, one of which has got to fruition in at least a beta version right now. So I'm going to talk about that one in this video. Maybe if the other one actually gets to something useful, come back to the other topic in another future video. But what are we going to talk about today? Well, it is PowerPC cards in the AA3000 Plus, and that's something in my earlier videos on this motherboard I was very keen to get going. So first of all, why the interest in PowerPC chips? Well, the Motorola had got to the end of the line with their development of the 68000 series with the 68060. That was as far as that chip line got developed. And we can see that today with the prices of the final revision of the 68060, the Rev 6 version, going for huge prices on eBay. So that was as far as that development got, but the question is, could you do anything further? Could you go for some faster CPU? And I seem to recall reading somewhere that some of the Commodore engineers even had begun to think about PowerPC processors as the next evolution of CPUs for the Amiga. But of course Commodore never managed to do that themselves. However, Phase 5, the original Phase 5, did bring out the Blizzard PPC and the Cyberstorm PPC cards for the A1200 and A3000, 4000 respectively. They are still available second-hand, obviously, if you can find one, but they are relatively pricey. So then the question arises, actually, is there any other way to get a PowerPC chip working on the Amiga? And a friend of mine called Hedeon on the EAB forum a long time ago started speculating about a card called the Sonnet 7200, which was an PCI add-in card for the Mac that added a PowerPC processor, and he rewrote the warp-up libraries to support the Sonnet 7200. And then the story moves on to what other PCI-based PowerPC cards can be supported by the Amiga. And actually there are a few. So we've got the original Sonnet 7200. We have got something called the PRPMC, either 800 series or 815 series. The 800 series often known as the Apocalypse cards, the 815 as the Ragnarok cards. We've got the Force Power PMC 250, sometimes known as the Rapture card, and we've got the Bigfoot Killer Nick cards, either the M1 or the K1, all of which are supported now by Hedeon's libraries on mediators, providing those PCI planes. Let's just talk about those cards a little bit more. First of all, Sonnet 7200 and the Rapture card, they were supported by the original library, but just from conversing with Hedeon, I'm not sure they're going to be supported in future. So kind of maybe those aren't the things to go after if you're thinking about getting into this area. The Apocalypse, Ragnarok and the Killer Nick cards all supported right now and going forwards, it would seem. But the Ragnarok one tends to be much more expensive, so I'm not going to look at that in this video. What I am going to look at is the Apocalypse card, which is this here. So let's look at that. First of all, it is an unfamiliar kind of shape and size and connectors for an Amiga add-in, and that's because it's not designed for the Amiga at all. These were sort of for embedded systems. So what have we got here? We've got the heatsink with the CPU actually underneath there. This is some sort of interface controller chip. some RAM chips, I guess, and some more on the back, and various other support chips and functions here, and these connectors on the end, which we'll come back to in a minute. But this is the Apocalypse card, the PRPMC 800 series. In fact, this is an 8005E to be precise. These, at least from time to time, are fairly readily available and reasonably affordable. I picked up this for $60 plus shipping a while ago. Perhaps they might be a little bit more expensive than that, but certainly a great deal cheaper than a Cyberstorm PPC card, for example. So that's the basic processor card, but that only gets you so far, because obviously you can't plug that straight into the Amiga. So alongside that you need a carrier card, and that is this here. This is a Ramix 239F. F just means fan, but it's the Ramix 239, and what this does is converts what are called PMC connectors here to the familiar PCI at the bottom. And yes, this is wider than our normal PCI because this is 64-bit PCI, but basically on an Amiga system we don't use these end connectors, and we could just plug this into a normal PCI slot like you find on a Mediator, or on the Prometheus card that we got in the background there, which we'll come back to in a minute. But this is the carrier board. Probably other carrier boards work too, but I've always found the Ramixes to be ones that you can actually find, although can be like ridiculously expensive. Just occasionally though, eBay sellers will sell off a batch of these relatively cheaply. And obviously the Apocalypse card's no good without one of these. What's the other reason for having one of these? Well, it's this voltage section up here which takes 5-volt input from PCI, which is what the Amiga will provide, and converts it to 3.3 volts, which is what the CPU card needs. So if you look at for alternative carrier cards, you need one that's going to deliver enough amps of 3.3 volts in order to power the CPU card. Something that just maps across PMC to PCI without doing the voltage isn't going to work. So you need both bits, and I would also suggest something with some active cooling on it as well, because cooling of these chips can be a bit of an issue sometimes in a closed Amiga case. So that's the carrier card. This is the Apocalypse card. The one other thing just to talk about on this specific card, not necessarily on all of them, is you might be able to see down here there, and let me see if I can zoom in a bit. There is a little header block, and one of these jumper points needs setting in order to get the Apocalypse card to work at all. You can put a jumper over there. I've just put a blob of solder over those two joints, so there's no possibility of that joint coming unstuck. And if memory serves, what that does is to stop the boot ROM on the card from actually starting up, and then so the card just sort of sits there dormant waiting for the Amiga to start it up properly, and that's necessary to get the Apocalypse card to work. Not required on other PowerPC cards. Just before we go any further talking about the Apocalypse, I think the other thing to say is the Killer Nick cards, the K1 and the M1, also supported. They are PCI already, so you don't need the carrier card. They'll just go straight in. I don't have one of those, so I can't show it to you, but they plug straight into the PCI slot. The one drawback with them is they only have 64 megabytes of RAM, whereas the Apocalypse and other cards have 128 or more megabytes of RAM. So that does restrict, if you're using a K1 or M1, the range of applications you can actually run on it. Anyway, enough of that for now. Here's the carrier card. Here's the Apocalypse. Let's see if we can put them together. so they just kind of mesh and clip quite solidly together like that. And you know, if I was doing this permanently, I'd put some screws in just to keep that nice and firm, but for now that's probably good enough just for testing purposes. That's the combination. You can see it is pretty thin and fits into a single PCI slot. There's a nice hole in the back of the carrier board here to let some air in, but sometimes I've found that you need to blow air actively into this port here just to keep this heatsink cool enough for operation. You know, your mileage may vary on that. So then all we have to do is whack this in the machine. Like that, and turn her on and let her start up. So here we are looking at the Workbench screen. I've just opened up EditPad there because the camera seems to lose focus unless there's something fairly definite on the screen, but I'm not actually going to use EditPad at all, at least not planning to. You'll also see that I've got a DF0 unreadable icon on the screen. Ignore that, it's nothing to do with what we're doing today. That is simply the fact that I've disconnected the floppy drive while I was getting inside the case and faffing about with other stuff. I think the other thing I just need to point out is that what I'm running here is a beta version of the library from Hedeon. With his permission, I'm one of the beta testers, and because of that I've had to remove all the other Zorro cards from the machine. It would seem, for reasons that aren't entirely clear why at the moment, having other Zorro cards in the machine stops it functioning. So they're out, which means I am down to 7 remaining megabytes of RAM here for the rest of the system, but so be it. That's what we need to do to get the thing working. Now, how does the system work? Well, there is a PowerPC library. That's the one that Hedeon has written that you put into libs. That's what's required to support PowerPC programs. But sometimes if you boot from that with that in libs to start off with, then actually that can lock up the system. At least in the earlier versions of the library that was the case. So kind of I've got into the habit, and I might as well show you this in my startup sequence, that I have a line here that just, if the library is in libs, it just deletes it at boot time. So that's what that's doing, just so there are no problems starting up the machine. And then I have a separate icon which I've got up here, and hopefully I'm keeping focus at the same time with this. All this does is to copy the library back to libs again, and then call a very small program called initppc, which just sparks up the PowerPC. So let's do that now. You can see it's taken some memory up here. Hopefully you can see that. That's just taken a few megabytes, and now it's jumped up to 118 megabytes. That's the 128 megabytes of RAM on the Apocalypse board have now been added into the Amiga system. So let's just run a quick which Amiga on that, and hopefully you can see. Maybe I will just zoom in a bit so we can see that a bit more clearly. Make the window a bit bigger. That it's a one warp up processor, 450 megahertz revision 17.4 for what that's worth, and 100 megahertz bus clock. So we've got that recognized now within the system. So that's working fine. So let's go and test a few things. I mean, perhaps the place to start with this, as always, when just fiddling about with PowerPC processors, just get that nicely on screen for you, is the program CyberPi, which is just a little test program just calculate some decimal places of pi here to 100 decimal places using the PowerPC processor. But to be honest with you, 100 decimal places is not stressing this system one little bit. So let's just do 10,000 places of pi, and there it is. I'm not going to vouch for the accuracy of all of that, but you can see he did the calculation in less than 1 second here, and then took another fraction just to spit it all out. So the PowerPC processor seems to be working okay. Let's try a few other things. So in my utilities directory, I've got something called voxel space. And again, a little bit of a zoom out might be in order here, just so you can see the whole screen. So this was one of the original warp-up demos, I think. And it's going to ask me what screen I want, so I'm going to do 640 by 480. And give it a second, and here we go. So it's the usual thing of being able to fly over sort of 3D landscape. This is me controlling, by the way, the where we're going here. And we can fly around, speed up, slow down, move around. Somewhere here there's a ziggurat. Here we go. See if we can walk up to the ziggurat. And really this is just sort of demonstrating the processing power of the PowerPC. In the top left hand corner there, I don't know if you can see it quite, but it's doing about 33 frames a second. So that's reasonably rapid. I mentioned the Ragnarok card earlier on. More expensive, it's not the Power anything, it's the PRPMC 815 series. Tend to be more expensive to get hold of, but they run the PowerPC 750FX chip, which is one of the more powerful, if not most powerful chips at 800 megahertz. That really rocks on this kind of demo. So that's enough of that. That is just pure PowerPC processing. Let's try some other stuff. Let's go into demos and see what we can get out of the old Gears demo. See if that comes up with anything. Yeah, there we go. And that is doing somewhere around, don't know if you can see in the top left hand corner there, probably pretty small, but it's doing about 80 frames a second, 80 frames a second, which is pretty nice. How does that compare to the 68K? No comparison really, is there? 68K looks pretty poor in comparison. What else can we try? Let's have a look at games. Just see about Quake 2, see if that will start. No promises on this. Remember, this is beta software. It did require some hacks to the Prometheus library as well, apparently, from Hedeon, just to get this to work. Let's just see what happens. So we've got startup, so something's happening. Initial animation. And we're loading. And hard disk activity light is frantically flashing at this point. I know you can't see that, but it looks like it's doing a lot of data transfer. So what next for this library, just while this is loading? Well, no doubt Hedeon will be working on some of the glitches in the library, e.g. enabling other Zorro cards to be used simultaneously, that kind of stuff. Don't know if there are any other bugs in it. And then no doubt releasing it out into the wild. So if you have an AA3000 Plus with the Firebird daughterboard in it, PCI slots in it, or if you've got an original Prometheus card, I suppose, then PowerPC becomes a possibility. So quite exciting times. Oh, here we go. So there's Quake 2. I don't know quite why I've got no sound here. Must be something I have goofed up on somewhere, but I'm sure there is no issue with the sound if the rest of the demo is playing okay. So there we are. PowerPC card working quite happily on an AA3000 Plus. Otherwise, we're out of time now. Look forward to catching up with you in the next video. This is Wrangler. Bye for now.